right, friends. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this really wonderful, crisp fall afternoon here in Toronto. My name is Tommaso Pavone. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of France and the Francophone World, CEFMEF, here at the Monk School at the University of Toronto. And on behalf of myself and Associate Director Ron Levy, I'm delighted to welcome you to our keynote lecture for the fall of 2025. That's the first of our talks in our thematic speaker series for the year on states and legalities under stress. This speaker series is jointly sponsored with U of T's Center for European and Eurasian Studies, directed by Ed Schatz, by the Institut Français du Canada under the auspices of the French Embassy. And I want to personally thank the Consul General here in Toronto, Bertrand Pousse, as well as Sylvain Corneveau, and the staff at the French Consulate for your support in making this lecture and the whole speaker series and exchange of ideas possible. The goal of this speaker series is to debate the unprecedented challenges facing democracy, rights, and the rule of law, and how it all relates to the shifting role of the state in the Francophone world. And nobody is better placed to get our discussion started than the two socio-legal scholars who have made this theme their life's work. Professor Stéphanie Hennette-Vauchez, who is professor of public law at Paris-Nanterre University and a member of the Centre de Recherche et d'Études sur les droits fondamentaux, and Professor Antoine Vaucher, who is research director in political sociology and law at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique and professor at Univers Paris 1 Panthéon Sorbonne. Professor Hennette-Vauchez is a leading scholar of human rights, religious freedom, civil liberties, and women's rights in France and in Europe. And in turn, Professor Vauchez has conducted pioneering scholarship tracing the legal and political development of both the French state and the European Union. Not only are both speakers innovative researchers and tireless public intellectuals, but I would be remiss if I did not mention that they're also incredibly generous colleagues and mentors, and I know this from my own personal experience. And it's in the spirit of generosity and public debate that Professors Hennette-Vauchez and Vauchez have joined forces to pen their first co-authored book that we will discuss today. It's a book titled Des Juges Bien Trop Sages, which roughly translates to Judges Too Wise for Our Own Good, because this is ultimately a talk about the public interest. Now, before turning things over to our speakers, I want to briefly situate their intervention and this fantastic book within the ongoing dialectic between two traditions for which France is so renowned. On the one hand, France has a long intellectual and social tradition of rights mobilization. This tradition champions the rule of law and is wary of executive power. France bequeathed for posterity perhaps the most influential manifesto for civil rights, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which was penned by the National Assembly in 1789 during the French Revolution. It was inspired by Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and this declaration in turn inspired generations of human rights documents, including the European Convention on Human Rights, France's own civil rights revolution during the 70s and 80s when women's reproductive rights were expanded, the death penalty was abolished, and France ratified the European Convention. It was French luminaries, particularly Montesquieu, who argued for the separation of powers in order to preserve rights and freedoms. And it was this notion of the separation of powers that inspired James Madison to famously proclaim that since government is made up of men and not of angels, the state must be constrained and divided so that ambition be made to counteract ambition. Yet alongside this rights-promoting tradition, France is equally well known for a rich statist tradition. This tradition champions executive action and is wary of social disorder. It's the tradition espoused by the prefect of the Seine under Napoleon III, Baron Haussmann, when he extolled how a centralized French state could make our country the most one in the world. It's the tradition embodied by Charles de Gaulle in one of his favorite aphorisms, quote, "First France, then the state, and then the law." It is the tradition of states of emergency, like the 2-year state of emergency declared after the Bataclan attacks that expanded police powers while limiting judicial oversight and freedom of assembly. And it's the tradition that led to the decidedly non-Montesquieuian development of the 2 Supreme Courts tasked with judging the French state, the Conseil Constitutionnel, the Constitutional Council, the Supreme Constitutional Court, and the Conseil d'État, the Supreme Administrative Court, both of which sit in the Palais Royal in Paris, because neither of these bodies are just courts. They're staffed with government ministers and civil servants instead of career judges. And rather than only serving a judicial role, the Conseil Constitutionnel also acts as a shadow legislator when it reviews the constitutionality of proposed legislation, while the Conseil d'État also acts as a shadow executive when it provides legal advice to the executive branch. So what happens when these 2 traditions, the rights tradition and the statist tradition, clash? How have the Constitutional Council and the Council of State mediated these conflicts? And what can the French experience tell us about the broader state of democracy, rights, and the rule of law in a period of extreme challenge across the world? To help us grapple with these challenging questions and wicked problems, please join me in welcoming Professor Stéphanie Hennette-Vauchez and Antoine Vauchez.
Thank you, Tommaso. Thank you very much for a very exciting introduction to this presentation. I can't wait for the presentation now. And thank you all, of course, for joining this afternoon, for listening about France. But of course, we'll try to make this not only about France, but also, as you said, about many of the questions that many democracies are facing today. Of course, I really want to thank Tommaso and the University of Toronto, the Center for French Studies, for this very kind invitation. It's really our true pleasure to be here. And so maybe just to start this talk, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that France generally still falls short of featuring prominently in conversations about illiberalism. However, the country has increasingly been a red flag for a number of international institutions and organizations in the recent years. And here you can see the cover of a recent report that was just published in September by the Fédération Internationale des Droits de l'Homme, which is the umbrella organization for all the national chapters of the Ligue des Droits de l'Homme, with a very telling title. It's in English, you can download it, France dropping out of democracy. And it's a report in which the Fédération Internationale des Droits de l'Homme really lists a series of very contemporary setbacks in terms of freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of demonstration, in a number of very fundamental civil liberties. It's also interesting, not only the content of the report, but also the fact that the Fédération Internationale des Droits de l'Homme imagined that it was important and relevant for them to actually pick France as a country of concern. So this is just a recent example of how over the past 10 years, human rights organizations and institutions have grown increasingly weary about France. And of course, when I say it's been 10 years, this coincides, it brings us back to 2015, and this coincides, as Tommaso has mentioned, with the state of emergency that was declared in November 2015. The state of emergency in France is a very specific legal regime that takes root in an act of 1955 that was the then dying Fourth Republic's answer to the beginnings of the independence war in Algeria. And of course, there's a lot to say about the post-colonial overtones of this regime, but what is really important, or what I really want to focus on right now, is just the fact that this is the legal regime that was activated in November 2015 in the wake of the attacks, and it remained in force for just a little under 2 years. But then again, in 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the government again had the reflex of activating a sanitary, this time state of emergency, that again stayed in force for 2 years. And so France has undergone this very peculiar experience in the past 10 years of having been governed for 4 years by a regime of exception. And this, of course, has had a lot of impact on what we're going to be discussing today. In fact, both Antoine and I, already in 2015, started paying attention to this state of emergency, and in particular to the ways in which it impacted the work of French courts, and how French courts in those moments appeared to have adopted a position of restraint, only cautiously reviewing acts of government or pieces of legislation, only rarely striking them down. And this is a position that we thought contrasted very strongly with the stakes raised by states of emergency in terms of their impact on fundamental rights. And in fact, it's not only scholars or human rights organizations that have underlined this cautionary position of courts in front of restrictions to fundamental rights, but it's also those institutions themselves. So, for example, in 2021, the Conseil d'État, so the Supreme Administrative Court, issued a report looking back at those two recent experiences of the state of emergency. And in the report written by the court itself, one can read that under a state of emergency, there is a new balancing of the competing requirements of security and the protection of freedom. And in fact, it's written in the report that the standards of judicial review, including proportionality analysis, doesn't operate the same way, because during a state of emergency, the imperatives of security weigh much stronger than in normal times. So it's really very interesting to see that we have a situation where not only there's a strong argument that courts are being more cautious, but courts are indeed themselves claiming that they are more cautious in those moments. There are, of course, many other examples of this. Here you have a picture of the Palais Royal, where both the Conseil d'État and the Conseil Constitutionnel sit. And here you have a picture of the deployment of armed forces in front of the Conseil Constitutionnel in April 2023, in the hours preceding the moment where the Conseil Constitutionnel was going to rule about a very contentious pension reform that you certainly have heard of. And this very strong deployment of police protection for the members of the Conseil Constitutionnel really strongly contrasts with the decision that was delivered. That was, again, a very cautious decision on merits. The Conseil Constitutionnel essentially dodged the hard issues of social rights and the ways in which they might have been curtailed by the reform. And on procedural grounds, it was also a very cautious decision where the Conseil Constitutionnel essentially said that even though the parliamentary process had been very contentious and very vertical, very somewhat brutal, with an unprecedented cumulative recourse to all sorts of mechanisms of constitutionalism that allow the government to avoid parliamentary vote. Well, nonetheless, even if this accumulation of procedures was unprecedented, there was no issue of constitutionality, which is basically what the Conseil said. So all these leads and many others just brought us to the question that is apparently very simple, but nonetheless important. Are fundamental rights really protected in France? What is the situation of the judicial protection of fundamental rights in France? And in order to do so, to address this question, we wanted to focus on these two judges, the Conseil d'État and the Conseil Constitutionnel, who are really judges of the state, in that they really, and that's the hypothesis we were trying to test in this book, these two courts are really state-oriented, and they're very, very sensitive to the imperatives of government. So as we asked this question, what about the protection of fundamental rights by courts in France? Of course, it's a question that is strongly echoed by a number of strands of the contemporary conversation. The next one, I think. Yeah. So there's a strong echo to this question in large strands of the contemporary conversation and academic debate in comparative law and politics. Just if we only look what's been published in the last decades, many authors have importantly documented a sobering era for constitutionalism, have questioned the strength of the rule of law and the ability of constitutionalism and the rule of law to resist various forms of capture or attacks from within, right? So some of the important works are on the slide here, and they have all convincingly made the case that there now exists an autocratic legal playbook, and that to a certain extent, as a playbook, it circulates. Court packing, denouncing the legitimacy of judicial decision-making, or tools that have circulated from Hungary to Brazil to Romania, Poland, the US, and other places. Of course, this literature is very important, but we felt that it remained very much anchored in a paradigm of global constitutionalism, and as such, mostly produces macro concepts and narratives about constitutionalism as a global phenomenon. However, we felt that this was not fully useful in terms of looking at what really happens when there are situations of backsliding or setback. First, because as setback literature, this literature proceeds from the largely unquestioned notion that there once existed a relatively stabilized global paradigm of constitutionalism, featuring a shared reverence at the global scale to the rule of law and the judicial protection of fundamental rights. And another problem is that it's difficult at that macro level, that of course is very important, but to factor in the historical, institutional, and sociological idiosyncrasies of every particular case. So that's why we embarked upon our project, which sought first to historicize the question, and then to try to enrich this macro perspective by distancing our project from the idea of a setback, because what we contend in the book is that in the case of France, the embrace of those features of global constitutionalism was in fact very short-lived, was very contingent on the convergence of a number of political factors, and overall, the embrace of this constitutional paradigm has been the exception more than the norm, in the sense that if its tools and principles did appear as prominent in French law and politics in the 1970s and 80s, they have much receded since then. And this, as we try to demonstrate in the book, has to do with the unique position and action of those two prominent courts that are really state courts that pay great attention to the imperatives of government.
Okay, so yes, and from that starting point, we have brought together in a way our competencies and our research experience in working on the case law of both the Conseil d'État and the Conseil constitutionnel. And what struck us, and that's somehow the claim that we're making here, is the extent to which both these supreme courts are, to a certain extent, we could say, indifferent to the question of fundamental rights. Let's be clear, we're not saying that they are actually not that human rights and fundamental rights have no importance for both of these courts, but we are rather making the point that they are being increasingly unable to make a difference in nature between fundamental rights and other motives that are pushed forward, for example, by the government or pushed forward by the legislator. The fact that, in a way, fundamental rights don't have a special status in the case law of both these courts. For one good reason is that both these courts are continuously bringing new motives of general interest, l'intérêt général, or of ordre public. And they are bringing about this concept or these claims on an equal normative rank as equal as human rights. They can be related to security reasons. They can be related to the making of competitive markets. They can be related to the securing of energy sovereignty for the state. But continuously, there is a making of new figures of the intérêt général, of which these two courts are the only judges in a way, because they are making them in a way themselves, because categories of general interest and of public order are very malleable in French law and the history of French law. So what we see in a way is the cases of environmental law. You will see motives of protection of the economy of agriculture, protection of agriculture's farmers against distortion of competition. These are elevated to the rank of issues of general interest that are to be balanced with ecological rights and constitutional rights in terms of environment. You could say the same with the protection of public health when it comes to COVID and the control over governmental measures of limiting the rights of circulation in the moment of COVID. So what is extremely interesting is that way through which both these Supreme Courts are actually making this building issues of general interest continuously vis-a-vis rights. With that comes a particular understanding of rights. Rights are perceived as the opposite of the general interest, not that they should not be defended, not that they shouldn't be secured to a certain extent, but they appear as somehow individual rights vis-a-vis the general interest. They appear to a certain extent even as sometimes individualist rights that against which the state has also to be protected. Doesn't mean that the state doesn't have to also protect individual rights, but it has to be also very moderate, because otherwise it can lead to a form of paralysis of the state if they're recognized, if claims of rights are recognized somehow too far. So then it gets to our question: how is it then that these two Supreme Courts are continuously coming with these motives of general interest vis-a-vis which rights are somehow weakened or devitalized, devitalisé, we would say, no? And the book investigates the sociology and the history of both these courts. In that sense, we are about idiosyncrasies of the French history and the French state. And we look first to, let's say, the history, and we look at what we've called the governmental habitus of both these courts, because we have to understand that both these courts claim to be judges not like the others. They jugent pas comme les autres. It's not only us putting this label on them, they're continuously claiming that they shouldn't be taken as judges like the others. One of the aphorisms that is continuously used by both these courts is juger, c'est encore administrer. Judges is administrating at the same time. And to see that, one has to go back to the long history of the Conseil d'État, created by under Napoleonic rule, in which the Conseil d'État was actually the Conseil de l'État, the advisor, the counselor of government, something which has remained up until today. It means that every law or every decree that the Conseil d'État is judging, well, the Conseil d'État has been advising up at the start of the decision process, has been advising the government regarding the legal quality of that decree, but not only the legal quality, also the opportunity of that decree. So it's at the beginning and at the end of the process when it comes to the legal fabric of the state. So it's not only the old history that has a very contemporary meaning. The Conseil d'État is also an institution that has really a symbiotic relationship with the Fifth Republic. In no republic has the Conseil d'État been so central, and particularly in securing le pouvoir de gouverner, la force de gouverner. Because as you may know, the Gaullist constitution is really about restoring the power of the state and the legal capacity of the government to govern, vis-a-vis the excesses of parliamentarism. And here the age-old case law of the Conseil d'État, which was essentially about securing that legal autonomy of the executive, became critical, instrumental in writing the Constitution. And then, of course, it's not only about the history of the Fifth Republic, it's also about the sociology of this corps, grand corps, as we call, like elite of the administration. Why? Because members of the Conseil d'État, but also members of the Conseil constitutionnel, well, they're actually not only judges. If you just zoom out and look at their whole career and the social space they've been covering all across their career, in and out of these courts, then you understand that they're not just courts. Indeed, they're not courts like the others. They've been actually occupying top positions as leading regulatory agencies, being top advisors of governments, and etc. So here you have a chart that was actually not made by us, but by Bruno Latour. Famously, Bruno Latour has written a book on the Conseil d'État with a completely different purpose. So, but there's this chart which is hard to read actually, but from even from here actually, but it shows the variety of here. Each one of this name is a member of the Conseil d'État at the time, but the picture is not different today. Wouldn't be different today, and you see entreprise publique, entreprise privée, gouvernement. Haute administration. What it means is that at a given moment, you have basically 300 members of the Conseil d'État. More than a third of them are actually outside of the Conseil d'État, in the government structure, if you want. If you take all the 300 people of the Conseil d'État today, 160 have been members of a cabinet ministériel, so top advisors of ministers. And you could say the same about members of the Conseil constitutionnel, although it's a completely different story because usually it is end of career type of position, but more than a majority of the 86 judges that have been judges at the Conseil constitutionnel have actually held political positions, and half have held administrative positions and 2/3 have held political positions. So that's why, in a way, when we look at them sociologically, in these members of the Palais Royal, as we call them, well, they actually are institutionally, sociologically, and cognitively close to governmental actors. By this, we mean that they don't conceive of their role of judges as a check and balance, as a sort of counterpower, but they conceive of their role as feeling co-responsible for government, which doesn't mean that they won't actually strike down some measures if it goes too far. They accompany the government and they somehow help the government to govern, which doesn't mean there's no form of external, no form of striking down. But the fear above all, when we look at them and they're working, is the fear that judges may actually paralyze the state, paralyze the capacity of government to govern. And in that sense, they're very much Fifth Republic institutions. From that, I will move to a second element now that I've looked at sociological and historical arguments about the Conseil d'État and the Conseil constitutionnel position in the state and in the field of power, if you want. Then there's this governmental habitus has been, of course, put under stress ever since the 1980s. Why? Because the French state, as many, actually most Western state, has been somehow encountering big bangs, facing big bangs. And there are three big bangs that the states have been facing. One is the entering into the single market, the European single market, for a state that is used to be and famous for being dirigiste, for having a public sector that was actually huge in the early 80s. And that's one first, of course, challenge. The second challenge has been terrorist attacks and the issue of security that came later from the years 2000, but was, of course, was a huge challenge for the state. And then the third one, which goes along all the history, is the period is globalization and how the state relates to and keeps the forms of sovereignty in this context. What we argue in the book And each chapter, we have a chapter on regulation and the entering into the single market. We have a chapter on the Big Bang of terrorism and security. We have a chapter on state and French state and globalization. Is that our members of the Palais Royal all have been somehow enrolled in this in the state response to this to these big bangs, and they've been if you take the example of the entering into the single market, it's hard to understand or to figure out the magnitude of change that is implied for the French state and the amount of law that was needed to make the transition from dirigiste state to regulatory state, from leading privatization, leading the new drafting new regulatory agencies, l'autorité de la concurrence, and a set of authorities that go along with that. So in that process, well, members of the Palais Royal and of the Conseil d'État in particular, they've been drafting the laws. They've been advising governments all along the way. They've been also judging these decrees on this administrative work. And of course, in that process, they've been fully enrolled in a way. So from that, we see how, yes, they've been engaged in rewriting public law, in rewriting all the key concepts of public law to make this change possible, to move from a place where service public was the legal and ground category of public law to a situation where competition and regulation is the core, is one of the core category of public law. And this has taken a lot of doctrinal work. You know, the Conseil d'État has a report annually that in which it gives its doctrine of the state. It took a lot, of course, of the doctrinal work in terms of publishing and of course of case law. So I'm not going to take too much time here, but one example also of their role in securing this and in moving this is, for example, the question prioritaire de constitutionnalité, which is a new procedure created in 2010. And this procedure allows for a preliminary, for a plaintiff to bring a case from an ordinary tribunal to the Constitutional Court in case fundamental rights are in question. So if one might say this is, of course, a progression or a strengthening of human rights. But the practice and 15 years of that question prioritaire de constitutionnalité, as many have shown in extended research, have been actually very much, you could say, in a way, hijacked by the claims that corporate lawyers, large firms, have been using, this new procedure to, to position themselves in this new regulatory state, to reposition state and market, and of course. And interestingly, the Conseil d'État and the Conseil constitutionnel, in their role as judges, they have accompanied this transformation, recognizing human rights to legal persons, recognizing forms of fundamental rights to large companies. And in that process, of course, as they were somehow completely enrolled in this transformation, well, devitalizing also to a certain extent the protection of individual human rights.
So yeah, we have that chapter on regulation that is one of the case studies that we use to show that these the members of these courts have accompanied public action and new grammars of political action more than they have held the government accountable. There are two other chapters in which we try to develop the same idea. So the first one is security, and so we really show how both as courts and as councils of government, they have accompanied the sort of securitary paradigm that France has followed, like many other countries, since the beginning of the 21st century. The chapter about globalization and sovereignty is also one where we show that these French courts embrace of international law that is so illustrative of the globalization, legal globalization, has always been a very ambivalent embrace, and they both these courts have really positioned themselves as gatekeepers of the domestic legal system, very cautiously deciding what kind of international and European law and to what extent can really penetrate the domestic legal order, and maintaining a number of mechanisms that allow them to push back, for example, denying any kind of authority or binding authority to findings by the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, for example, right? Which of course is very awkward because we think legal globalization, but really when you look at what they do, they really preserve those instruments that allow them to maintain international law at bay. At the same time, in the chapter, we also show all the diplomatic work that they engage in, trying to secure a good representation of France in a number of international arenas, right? So on the one hand, they try to contain the authority of international law. On the other hand, they really make sure that the director of legal affairs in the European Union or positions of judge at European courts are maintained and occupied by French individuals and preferably by members of the Council of the Conseil d'État. Another aspect of the book, and I'll accelerate a little bit here, is why do we do all this? What is the purpose of trying to show how they have been so active in accompanying governmental action? One contribution that we hope to have, and Antoine referred to it in passing earlier, is to invite readers and all of us to think about the importance of everything that connects courts, rights, and democracy, and maybe try to think about that in a new way. Try to push back against an understanding of rights that is only a negative understanding, that is rights as limitations, external limitations on the exercise of political power, but also what we want to do is try to renouer, how do you say that? To revitalize, renew a conception of rights where there's actually something to say about the discursive promotion of rights with courts, not only with courts, but also with courts. Try to highlight the notion that courts as other actors have an important role in this discursive production, iterative expansion of rights, and not only look at rights as individual interests that justify external limitations on political power. In order to substantiate that claim, 3 other chapters of the book are devoted to pressing contemporary issues faced by many democracies: the challenge of the protection of the environment, that of equality, and that of the openness and inclusion of all the voices, knowledge, and experience that emanate from civil society. So, for reasons of time, I won't mention the first 2, but I just want to give you an idea of what we try to do, say a few words about the 3rd chapter, so the one on civil society. What we try to do on this topic is really show 3 ranges of attitudes that the Conseil d'État and the Conseil constitutionnel have had in recent in the face of recent evolutions of public policy with respect to civil society, and show how those could be changed, right? So one thing they have done is that they have accompanied political reforms that have sought to weaken the protection of civil society rights and freedoms, right? So here we look in depth at the fabrication of and the passing of a very important 2021 act in France called Act Comforting the Principles of the Republic, that really is an unprecedented restriction on rights of associations, civil society organizations. First, because it expands the conditions in which the President of the Republic may dissolve a civil society organization. And it also imposes on all civil society organizations, if they're going to apply for public subsidies, to commit to a contract of Republican commitment by which they sign off to a series of principles that are really interesting to look into in detail, but maybe we can do that in the Q&A. But what is interesting, what we try to focus on is to show how from the inception of the bill, when the Conseil d'État was consulted as Conseil d'État, saw nothing, no problem with the issue. When the Conseil Constitutionnel had to review the legislation, once it had been adopted by the Parliament, saw nothing, no problem at all either. They have, in the language they use that we analyze in detail, you see how they really accompany public action more than they alert to the extent to which it might be too big of an infringement into fundamental rights. A second thing that we look at is the ways in which they also present with a lack of resistance to public policy injunctive turns in select areas. So we look here in particular at immigration law and the legal principle of laïcité. Bad translation would be secularism. And here, it's really interesting to see in both these fields how over the past 25 years, there's been what we call an injunctive turn. So there's a lot of commandments that are made for aliens, and there's a big us versus them narrative that fuels the evolution of the constitutional principle of laïcité. And here again, we see that neither in the name of social rights nor in the name of religious freedom, for example, to take just these two examples, have the Conseil d'État or the Conseil Constitutionnel represented any kind of significant limit on these evolutions. And the third thing that we do is show how throughout all these evolutions, the Conseil d'État in particular continues to claim to have a finer knowledge of what is needed in front of those issues of immigration, secularism, civil society. Antoine referred to it, the Conseil d'État publishes annually a report, and even more than annually, they very regularly choose topics that are important and on which they wish to make recommendations to the government. It is really striking to look at their choice of topics. Fundamental rights, never. There has not been a report by the Conseil d'État, either the annual report or those free, the reports on which they freely or pick a topic, well, in fact, not freely, in coordination with the Secrétariat Général du Gouvernement. And so this leading to that, it so happens that fundamental rights are never really a topic of interest. They will write reports on the government of water. They will write report on the importance of regulatory agencies. They will write reports on data privacy. So sometimes, of course, there will be a fundamental rights aspect, but the protection of fundamental rights itself is never really a topic. And what is really interesting is to also look not only at the choice of topics, but also the kinds of voices or concerns that they echo. And we find that there's a very selective bias here with a sort of ignorance or very poor attention paid either to those voices and knowledge brought about by civil society organizations, or those voices and knowledge brought about by institutions that in the French legal systems are endowed with the task of protecting fundamental rights. La Commission consultative des droits de l'homme, the Constitutional Authority Défenseur des droits for the protection of rights, the Conseil contrôleur général des lieux de privation de liberté that looks at detention. All these voices are mostly unheard in those reports.
Do I have a couple of minutes so
yes.
I can to finish?
Last slide.
Okay, last slide. So, I mean, it gives me the opportunity in conclusion to somehow, question the project of the book. I mean, in a way where we are assessing somehow the performance of these two courts. their performance in terms of human rights.
These are the big bangs of the French state.
This is big bangs. So we're assessing the performance of these courts. The issue is not for the sake, in a way, of criticism, in the sense that we are also fully aware, and we were fully aware as we engaged in that book and in entire inquiry, that we are in a particular moment. And that actually we, particularly in France, where the extreme right is close to power to a certain extent, is rising to power. And then we might actually need these courts in a way when serious times and heavy weathers can show up. But at the same time, we thought it would worth taking the risk of criticism. Why? Because I think to a large extent, rights and courts are not just about, again, protecting us against abuse of power or executive power, but they're also about the liveliness and vitality of democracy. They're about recognition of groups, recognition of the scope of the political community. And in that sense, they're also about the antidote to the rise of extremism. In that sense, I think the criticism is actually part of a democratic mobilization, and that's really also in that spirit. So last point, what are we proposing in a way, in the end, in conclusion, because we're making few proposals in terms of reform. I think given the map that we've been drawing, the first reaction would be, here we have a sort, with this governmental habitus, we have a sort of systemic conflict of interest. How can you be at the same time governing, counseling the government and judging the government? And I think to a certain extent, this question of impartiality, this question of biases, selective biases in favor of government and reason and policies is a fair question. You know, we have today, you know, weird things that may sound weird to a foreign ear, former heads of states that can be members of the Conseil constitutionnel, again, judges of the Conseil d'État that keep moving in and out of government and judging government, all sorts of these reasons that are indeed issues. But we don't think the issue of impartiality, the issue of independence is enough. I think to a certain extent, there's a risk to move too much along the track of impartiality, but by thinking essentially reform as cutting the ties between Conseil d'État, Conseil constitutionnel, and the state and politics. I think in a way, in the context of rising extreme right, for example, there are good reasons to think that we can not only rely on judicial heroism, even if impartial and independent, this would certainly be too weak of a support point, you know, for democracy. So the issue of impartiality bears the risk of isolating the judge. Of course, impartiality is very important, but cutting all ties can also be a risk. So I think we end up thinking in terms of cultures of rights, human rights cultures, in and outside of the state, and in particular, how the definition of intérêt général that we've been showing being extremely important in the reasoning of the Conseil d'État, how the definition, the circuit in which we define general interest, can not be a sort of face-to-face relationship between the Conseil d'État and government, but a larger circuit of definition that also includes these human rights agencies, these NGOs, within and outside of the state. And this are constituting, of course, the support groups that can make up a culture of human rights. Merci de votre attention.
Okay, friends, we're gonna get ready to pass around a microphone, but I just want to open with one question myself, and then we're going to open things up to everyone. I really encourage everyone to purchase this book, especially if you can read French. For now, it's only available in French. Hopefully, we'll get an English translation soon. I mean, even for those of us who are seasoned socio-legal scholars of France, there's so much to learn. I didn't realize, for instance, the extent to which the Constitutional Council doesn't use international law to adjudicate the constitutionality or the legality of proposed legislation, under the logic that a law could violate international law but be constitutional. I didn't realize that non-discrimination law doesn't feature at all in the case law of either of these two courts. And I didn't realize that they've constructed this notion of general interest as a counter-opposing interest to rights, as opposed to rights being part of the general interest, which seems to potentially make a bit more sense. So anyway, it's a really fascinating book. Just to get us started, and then I'm going to turn things over to you, and we'll pass around a microphone. We'll go with Ran Herschel first. You know, one of the insights of political science scholarship in the past few years is that basically the law and the separation of powers might be something, but it's not enough to save us from illiberalism. A culture of rights and the rule of law has to be constantly reaffirmed, on the one hand, by political elites exercising forbearance, so not using the full powers of the government that are available to them, sometimes holding back, right? And on the other hand, from a citizenry that's vigilantly committed to liberal democracy and the rule of law. So I'm wondering, if we step back from the Conseil constitutionnel and the Conseil d'État, to what extent is this a broader story of elites abandoning their commitment to forbearance on the one hand, and liberal democracy not having the popular appeal it once did on the other hand? Get us started, and then we'll pass around the microphone. We'll start with Ran. Yeah, please.
Okay.
Vas-y.
Okay. Well, I got but I really think this is the one of the underlying purpose of the book, to reposition these courts into transformations of the policy agenda, and you could even say the policy obsessions of political and administrative elites. In the sense that it's hard to understand where these courts are going if we don't reposition them in this great transformation agenda, again on liberalization of the French state, security, and securing something of remaining sovereignty in the context of globalization. So in a way, I mean, it's probably obvious to a certain extent now that we have, or that we've bring together this scholarship, and then but at the same time, in the comparative and the general discourse about the Conseil d'État and the Conseil constitutionnel, they're really taken only as courts. They're really taken only as the equivalent of other other supreme courts. And I think in their case, it's difficult to understand them if you don't reposition them in the whole history. So in that sense, it's equally true for the culture of human rights. There cannot be a culture of human rights for both these courts if the political and administrative elites are not themselves, in a way, taken into that circuit, or re-anchored in a way in that circuit of human rights. NGOs, but also agencies in charge of défenseurs des droits, for example.
Great, let's pass around the microphone. And if you could please just quickly introduce yourself.
All right, thanks. My name is Ran Herschel. I'm a professor here at the Faculty of Law and the Department of Political Science. Thanks for coming to Toronto and sharing with us your insights. And this is really fascinating. As all of us who travel around the world and give lectures, there is this, sociological or academic sociology barrier between the legal academia in France and the English-speaking world. So we definitely look forward to the English translation of this book, so that you can become famous and many of us can learn more about what's going on in France. So truly fascinating, but I want to push you a bit about the net theoretical yield of what you're saying and the placement of all of this in the general literature. So you started in framing this in the literature of autocratic legalism, constitutional capture, challenges to democracy worldwide. I didn't see it at all in the work that you presented. Maybe it's to me, what you presented sounded more like this ought to be placed in the general literature on the judicialization of politics and public policy worldwide, how courts worldwide become more and more involved in determining critical policy and political outcomes that define and divide entire nations. And in that context, it seems to me that those two tribunals in France and their connection to the state shouldn't be that counterintuitive or surprising, because you yourself admit that those two institutions have been part and parcel of the statist apparatus in France almost by definition. So obviously it shouldn't come as a big surprise that what they do is they complement what the government does in a way and help transform. They are part of the national decision-making apparatus in some way, like Robert Dahl once said about the US. So I want to push you a bit about the net theoretical contribution here and whether towards the end, I think this was just the last slide, what you propose, the shift to separation of powers, more rights jurisprudence, NGOs, civil society, all of this is going to push the entire French constitutional system and constitutional culture in a direction that is not organic to its nature. And it's going to, it's a blatant term, but it's going to Americanize French constitutional culture rather than preserving its unique stature and contribution to the world of comparative constitutionalism. Thank you.
Just a few words and I'll pass on to Antoine. The reason we referred today, which we don't, in fact, so much in the book, to the, all the literature on autocratic legalism and all of that, is not, is not trying to suggest that there is something of that kind happening in France, but was just to position it. What we found really striking is that all that literature is really about backsliding, about setbacks, right? And what we wanted to hint at is that it's really difficult to think in terms of setback. What the story we want to tell is not a story of setback. It's a story about the rule in France in the Fifth Republic has been France being a spectator to the grand play of globalization of constitutionalism and not an actor. And it is true that, as I very quickly referred to, there's a moment in time, maybe in the 70s and 1980s, where it does so happen that there is that a number of political and institutional actors in France seem to take part into this emerging globalizing of constitutional standards. But it was very short-lived. And up until then, and since then, what we see is the, statist reading of the French legal system. So again, it's really not to say that there's something of the sort of autocratic legalism happening, but just to say that the concept of a setback or backsliding doesn't really feed well, because the true story of the Fifth Republic has been not to take part in this globalization of constitutionalism.
And if I may add also something, you've come out with the difficult word Americanize, which of course is a sort of provocation to French immediately. Now, so I don't think there. I think in a way Tommaso had introduced very well the thing as a tension. There is a tension and a structural tension in French law and legal institutions between the human rights tradition, which is certainly not purely American, but has its own, history, very strong in also, in terms of also what we call today NGOs, but la Ligue des Droits de l'Homme comes from the late 19th century. Pardon? Yeah. And so there's a long tradition of human rights, which is not American, which has also anchoring in the state, and anchoring also in the Conseil d'État and the Conseil constitutionnel. Maybe our presentation, for the sake of the argument, made the case of a two one-sided case, but the question is, how is it that segments of the Conseil d'État, which are more human rights or rights oriented, have somehow been marginalized in a way in the story, while they were in the 1980s up until mid 90s actually somehow leading the institution, leading the agenda of the institution. Okay, and so that in that sense, it's not about sort of organic reading of institutions. It's more about a contradiction and a tension that goes through history, but has a particular moment with these huge big banks, with these big banks, which actually have destabilized the French state and put that governmental habitus into tension, because in a way they had to be, they had to build the law for that transformation.
We'll have Ron and then Igor. If you can just introduce yourselves. Let's collect two pairs of questions now.
Ron Levy, Monk School in Sociology. Old collaborators, so it's my chance to take revenge. So I love this, but I have a question. It sounds to me like you have a court either of its people. Let's imagine they are a soccer team. Right, and they're thinking about how to bring the state into the agenda all the time. So it's a court of a team, right? A court of issues. Maybe they're like encyclopedia salesmen, right? They know what issue the government needs to hear about, and they're going to sell it, right? Or it's a court of tricks and techniques. And I think Stephanie, I think you were talking about some new techniques that were being developed, right? Maybe they're magicians, right? They're not soccer players, they're magicians. And I'm wondering which you think it is. Is it a soccer team that involves the state in its writ large? Is it that they're encyclopedia salesmen and they're hoping that the state will buy this one if only they sell you the right binding and the right volume? Or is it that they're magicians and they're recreating the state at every turn through a new technique or through a new device, a new legal device? And I say that, I do promise there's a question at the end of this, because I wonder, are they reading the letters to the President of the Republic? Like, that'd be interesting. Are they reading those? Are they reading press releases from the Ministry of Finance? Like, what are they attuned to if they're going to be these sorts of players who are brokering the public, the general interest? So.
We'll just get one more, and then we'll keep going.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Diego Tuesta. I am a PhD candidate at the Center for Criminology. So, well, I appreciate the sociological perspective, which I find it not very common in more legal-oriented talks. So one comment and two very short questions. I don't know if I miss out on something, but I wish maybe an example of a key example of how these courts disregard fundamental human rights. But the question is, following from the sociological perspective that you brought, and maybe marrying a little bit of Bourdieu and Foucault, would be understanding that the legal field is a field of competition, negotiation. How does it look like? How are they elected? How do political forces struggle for power there? And the third one, maybe more Foucauldian, is how in this context, how does resistance look like from the perspective of civil society and from perspective of political forces as well? I think those are my two concrete questions. Thank you.
Okay, you got 4 questions for the price of 2.
Comme tu veux. Vas-y, commence.
Okay, thank you for interesting and difficult questions. I don't know to what extent I will be able to get to a convincing answer. I mean, are they Socratic players or actors or magicians? I mean, the easy answer would be both of them, of course. In the sense that, I mean, methodologically, if we think of the Conseil d'État, it's, we shouldn't think about I mean, we've been, of course, talking about the Conseil d'État, but it's not a unitary actor. It speaks with a variety of voices. It speaks as a doctrinaire de l'État in its annual report. It speaks as a judge in its rulings. And in other ways, the same people talking. It speaks as a president or vice president of the Conseil d'État, which is actually the premier fonctionnaire, the first civil servant in ranking. So in that sense, there's a variety of voices. And in that sense, the trick is in the variety of voices that are not continuously aligned, are not continuously, there's no conspiracy whatsoever, but they're certainly taken into the same movement, overall movement. And, in that sense, it's a chorus in a way, more than a Socratic or a magician trick. It's a chorus of voices that indeed is taken into transformations of the state and a new policy agenda. And then very briefly on resistance different or disagreements in that context. I mean, what we've been seeing in a way is that the Conseil d'État is a supreme administrative court, but it has lower ranks tribunals. They're not part of the core of the body, but they're local administrative judges. And these ones don't circulate within the states, or very little. These ones are actually true, or to consider themselves actually as true judges. These ones actually take law very much more seriously, or in a way at face value, I would say. They're not afraid of juridisme, as the word is often criticized at the Conseil d'État. Let's not be too juridiste. And so in a way, change comes also from there, from the criticism that's emerging from the low ranks that are not part of this body, Conseil d'État, but are increasingly criticizing the hold that the Administrative Supreme Court, particularly as Stephanie has shown in part of her work, and I will actually leave it to you to say it, but in the state of emergency measures for which the local lower rank administrative tribunal have been much more protective of rights than the higher rank Supreme Court Conseil d'État. That may be one.
No, I maybe just wanted to give an example, because it's true, we didn't give any examples, so that was pretty dry, I guess. But no, just the example that comes to my mind, because I it brings together a number of things that we wanted to say, is a relatively recent ruling that was actually very much expected, because only recently legislation has allowed class action in the field of discrimination. And there's a group of 6 NGOs that came together in order to try, to carry a class action, trying to have the Conseil d'État declare that the state had failed to take measures to prevent discriminatory practices by the police force, right? Especially stop and frisk and all of that, right? And there's mountains of literature, reports by civil society organizations, by the Constitutional Authority for the Protection of Rights, that document the discriminatory practices in the police in terms of stop and frisk. So these 6 NGOs come together, file the class action. There's like years of work that is put into this, with thousands of pages of evidence coming from, everywhere, international organizations, local interviews of people, all sorts of evidence. And the Conseil d'État comes or has to rule on this. And well, first it rejects the case and it says, there's no systematic discriminatory practice. But not only the outcome is unfavorable for the protection of rights, but the reasoning is also extremely striking, because while the class action organizations had brought, again, thousands of pages of evidence, the Conseil d'État says, okay, there's evidence that there's discrimination. Okay, there is some form of discrimination, and it's not isolated facts. But I here have another report. So you have thousands of pages by the civil society organizations, and they pull out another report by the deontologue of the Ministry of Interior, who happens to be a member of the Conseil d'État, and who has written a report saying there's discrimination, but it's not systematic. Right? So, and the Conseil d'État says, this says systematic, this says not systematic, I'm gonna go with this, right? And therefore dismiss the case. And I find, that is, in my mind, very emblematic, because it's a massive human rights issue. It's been, again, very much documented and debated for 15 years. There's a new procedure. There's a lot of legal work, serious legal work put by serious human rights organizations into this. And in the overall balance of, what are you going to factor into the legal reasoning? There's this, compelling authority for the Conseil d'État of this report by one of their people in the Ministry of Interior that somehow manages to weaken the case brought by the civil society organizations. That would be one example of the kinds of things that we're documenting in the book.
Fascinating. Do we have more questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for this talk. My name is Jason. I'm a third-year undergrad at the Monk School and IR and PCJ. So if I can understand a bit of I'm also not in the legal field, even though I'd like to be in France. If I understand this correctly, there's a bit of this like government professional nexus of fonctionnaires publics, privés, haute administration, who go between les hautes cours and between the government and kind of like go between the three, four, go back and forth. And you kind of point out to the strength of this institution is kind of being so deeply enshrined in the state apparatus and having kind of this insight in it, but at the same time kind of being its weakness. I'm curious on, you're envisioning a future for it and institutional reform. You didn't really elaborate too much on it. So I'm a bit curious on what you envision reform to look like and what you envision to be the challenges to this reform. I know you mentioned isolation a bit. If you could maybe elaborate on that, but also on other things that you haven't mentioned.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm going to add a second question that I had as well, and we still have time for more. So if something comes to mind, which is, it's interesting because, maybe the audience might have expected you to come give a very different talk. They might have said, well, in contrast to what's going on south of the border, look what's happening to how French judges are holding the highest level politicians accountable. We have a former president, Nicolas Sarkozy, who is in jail. We have the trial and the conviction against Marine Le Pen. So that brings to light this other judicial organ that you didn't speak much about, which is the juges judiciaires, the civil and criminal judges, that do seem in important ways to be standing up for the rule of law. And so I wonder why they don't feature more prominently, or why you think in some ways they're being marginalized by the Conseil d'État and the Conseil constitutionnel. So this is not the story is not Sarkozy, the story is not Marine Le Pen, the story is the Conseil d'État, Intérêt Général, and the like.
Well, so those are very important questions. And of course, we're not saying the story is not them. It's just that our story is not them. But we do think that our story is important because as a matter of fact, when we talk about judges, the reflex would be to talk about them, to talk about the juges judiciaires, but also to talk about those other administrative judges that Antoine was referring to, all those in the lower courts. Because what is really important to understand is that administrative courts is the Conseil d'État, which is a whole separate world to itself. It's a corps. And then you have all the lower courts, first instance and administrative appellate courts that are a different world. And juges judiciaires, civil and criminal judges, and lower administrative courts think of think of themselves and are formally judges, magistrates, with all the corresponding protections and guarantees in terms of independence and obligations of impartiality. And it so happens that either in the judicial system or in the lower administrative courts, we do find this positioning that is much more assertive very often when fundamental rights are threatened, especially through government action. So that's a given, but what we really wanted to do is really show, by contrast, how peculiar the positioning of the Conseil d'État and the Conseil constitutionnel is, and to really show the tension in the fact that they call themselves judges or courts, even though courts not as others. So they both want to be courts, but they also confess that they cannot really be those courts because they're just too close to the state. And it's interesting in terms of understanding the French system, but it's also interesting in these global conversations because it really shows how lost in translation you can be when you talk about, you know, constitutionalism and constitutional courts. I've always been very, very uncomfortable in a million international conferences where people talk to me about constitutional justice in France. I'm like, yeah, well, it would take a while, you know, to really understand what we're talking about because, you know, by many standards, the Conseil constitutionnel just doesn't compare to a. Right. But that was too long and messy, but maybe you want to add something?
Well, no, I think the case of the juge judiciaire, that other judge, is extremely important. Although why we've chosen the other two courts, those of the Palais Royal, it's not only because they are in the same building, and because that building was, you know, created or imposed by Richelieu, etc. But it's also because I think these other judges, in a way, are not taken in the same sort of symbiosis with government. Doesn't mean that they don't have also that history of the state, you know, ingrained in the way of judges in judging. But exactly as you were mentioning, the case of condemning Sarkozy, former President Sarkozy, or condemning Marine Le Pen for fraud and to European subsidies. What is interesting is the interpretation that these courts are making, extensive interpretation that these courts are making of the obligations, the ethics of politics. Exactly, you know, we're very different from the way the Conseil d'État considers politics. The ethics of politics being that, as said by the prosecutors in both cases, it's because you're a politician that you have more devoirs, duties. It's because you're a politician that you will have a stronger guilt or stronger sentence. Merci. It's because you're a politician that you have a stronger sentence because you have to be exemplary. So the words are extremely tough on politicians. The vision of politics held by the juges judiciaires, as we call them, is extremely critical. And actually, they've come out with a notion of ordre public, as is often, or intérêt général, if you want, in the decision on Le Pen, which is an ordre public démocratique. It's literally in the decision of the juge judiciaire. In the name of this ordre public démocratique, the fact that Marine Le Pen has not recognized her guilt, the fact that Marine Le Pen is saying that she will continue the same practices, 2 years before the presidential election, it's too dangerous to leave her being a candidate at the presidential election because there's something higher, which is the democratic public order. So there's really something to contrast, but that was beyond the purpose of the book.
We have two more questions here. Yes.
Thank you. Todd Foglesong at Monk School. This has been utterly delightful, and I think I want to emphasize that. This has seemed extremely pleasant listening to your talk, so I want to thank you for that. There's something aesthetically distinct about your presentation today. I think I have 1.5 questions, or maybe 2. One is probably a stupid question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is really about, do you think about England? And if so, are your observations about, not in that sense, I mean, and if so, are your observations or your ideas about what's happening in England radically different from the way you think about what's happening in France? So a lot of legal scholars, barristers in England are upset that the court seems to be reneging on its relationship to European jurisprudence, abandoning the European Convention on Human Rights, developing doctrines that originate in Europe, but are being used to sort of move back to the common law where we always should have been. So I wonder if you see that at all as analogous, even if it's got a separate source, right? Your argument about France is this is about France, this isn't about global sort of trends. Is that, how do you think about England if you do think about England? And if you don't like the question, let me ask the other question, which is, when you present your book to either the Conseil d'État or the Conseil constitutionnel, how are they going to react? What are they going to say? Damn it, we've been exposed by these legal scholars in ways that we didn't expect. Or are they going to say, fantastic, finally someone understands us rightly? I mean, what's the reaction that you anticipate from them?
We have one more question at the back, and then we'll continue with questions. It's great. Yes. Yes.
Hi, I'm Yusuf, PhD student in the Department of Political Science. Just elaborating a little bit on an earlier point that Tom's kind of made, and a lot of what you guys are discussing, particularly with Le Pen being with the court case going on there, Sarkozy's, the whole thing, what's happening with Sarkozy. And just on this discussion on France, wouldn't this be signs of strong institutions and actually a healthy democracy in that case, when you look at what else is going on around the world, where you've got, often or not, when it comes to former heads of state, most governments tend to not go down that road and saying, hey, we want to prosecute. Just look what happened a few months ago in the United States. The other aspect is, you guys have talked a little on constitutional courts. I've done a bit of work on the South Africa case, which Tom and I spoke about earlier today. So is this something you guys would consider drawing on, seeing from lessons from outside as well, as, hey, what could France could really do with this?
Really comparative questions, I think, both of them. Yes, please.
No, we haven't been thinking a lot about England while we wrote this book. Probably we should. So, you know, I'm not sure about the parallels and the extent to which they might be relevant, but it is true that there are a number of rhetorical moves that are interestingly compared. First is that the Brexit, which, as we know, when we look at England, wasn't initially a project to leave the EU, but was a project to leave the Council of Europe and the European Convention of Human Rights. That, for example, has an echo in France. I mean, there, you know, in the last presidential campaign, when was it, 2017? Yeah, no, in the one before last, in the 2017 campaign, the man who was going to be the, you know, very serious contender for the Conservative Party campaigned on France leaving the Council of Europe. And exactly with the same kind of rhetoric, like, we need to go back to something that is not different. We're not going to ignore human rights, but we really always have them in the common law. We really always have them in our system, right? So that kind of rhetoric is present, but I hear that parallel more in political discourse than really in the kind of material that we've been looking at. And in terms of, you know, what the Conseil d'État and the Conseil constitutionnel might say when we present the book. The book has only been out a few weeks, so we haven't had that chance yet. In fact, I'm not sure we will have the chance at all, you know, of directly engaging with them in an institutional capacity. Because one of the things that we mentioned in the book in passing is that the ways in which these courts are very closed worlds that really speak to each other is also that they are not extremely open and in dialogue with academia. And it's not certain that, you know, there will be occasions, there will be individual occasions of, you know, us knowing a particular individual member of those courts, but really in terms of engaging. And I think that's actually very interesting. And I could go on because there's even been a number of moments of tension in the relationship of both these courts with the notion, let alone the practice of academic critique of those institutions. And that's also something that is a very strong feature of both these institutions. And South Africa, I just don't know. No, I mean, what I'm taking from these questions is that I think it's very, it would be very interesting to try to test the kind of reading that we're trying to do in other domestic contexts. You know, it's just a lot of work. I mean, we write this book after both working for a large number of years on various projects that, you know, always helped us identify that the Conseil d'État and the Conseil constitutionnel were somewhat central black boxes, and it takes a while to, you know, really gather the material to try to start unpacking that. But I do think it would be, you know, maybe a more collaborative and comparative project to try to replicate that same kinds of questions for other courts.
I may just jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
Very, very briefly, but I think one element that, I mean, we've not built this work as a comparative, but I hope it will, you know, continue as potentially a platform or a beginning for comparative work. One element that France's special case in a way is a magnifying glass off in a way. As we look at the Conseil d'État and the Conseil constitutionnel in particular, is the extent to which judges take into account, you know, the issue, the sort of autonomous raison d'être de l'État. You know, the importance of the state in judicial reasoning. Its, you know, its efficiency, its, you know, avoiding its paralysis. I think what is striking about the Conseil d'État is this autonomous legal raison d'État, which is changing over time, of course, evolving, but still very much entrenched. And it's a question is rarely asked when we study judicial review in other countries. What is actually the relationship of the judges to the state, not only to governments, but to the raison, you know, to the continuity of the state. And the Conseil d'État brings an excellent example of that, I think.
One last comment, and then we'll have one last round, the last round of questions. I mean, I think there's a real sense here in which what you've done is you've traced the French path towards which judges have contributed to executive aggrandizement. And you've shown both the vulnerabilities of the French path, which is that the French constitutional system has always been vulnerable to this internalized logic of raison d'État due to the lack of judicial independence of the two most important courts. But I think you've also shown areas where, in contrast, for instance, to what's going on in Hungary or the United States, where part of the erosion of democracy and rights is coming through just courts participating in legalizing grand corruption, the corruption of the Orban government, the corruption of the Trump administration. It will be interesting to see whether the spirit of the ethics and raison d'État actually act as a bulwark against that form of corrosion. It would be hard to see the Conseil d'État participate or being complicit in legalizing grand corruption, precisely because of this mythology of raison d'État and general interest. So that it'll be interesting to see the relative weaknesses and strength of the French path. But there's a couple more questions. I think Ron, and then yes, and then I think there's you had your.
I'm sorry. It's okay. I think it was about, you know, if legal reforms are not performed now, not just legal reforms. French people, you're right, it's probably civil war revolution, and it will be late to go from peaceful way. I mean, you know, general population is very unsatisfied. It's said for a long time. And I think it is an effort, you know, of people who have to their heart, their country, and everyone around to do something. To do something now when it's still possible, because, you know, France is a great country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, Ron, and then back there. Well, last questions.
So, you know, I love the idea of collaboration, but I hope we don't. And here's why, right? It seems to me collaboration presumes that we'll be looking for judges and their roles here, or somewhere, or South Africa, or Hungary, right? But if you take instead the function, what's happening here? Who or what exercises those functions?
Yeah.
And maybe somewhere else, it's the chief ethicist, right? And so just thinking about these as functions rather than, I don't mean to not believe, but I mean not believe that they're judges. Don't start from the presumption that the function is held by judges. And so then that's why I hope we don't collaborate on that.
Okay. Promis.
Bonsoir, merci. Thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask the question.
Can you introduce yourself just super quick?
Oh, yes, sorry. I'm Sandra with the Center for European and Eurasian Studies. I'm a master's student. So how do you mobilize and implement judicial reform when the government can't even elect a stable leadership in parliament? Because it is a problem, and in 2 years, the far right may come into power. And so, and they might load the Conseil d'État with loyalists. I'm not sure entirely how that process works, but yeah, so, and then what is your ideal solution, I would say? And is this like an executive, legislative, or maybe like an NGO problem to solve?
Thank you. Yeah, well, I mean, I fully agree. To start with Ron, I fully agree. I mean, I hope we will collaborate. But on the idea of indeed what sort of functions or the Conseil d'État is actually playing, and indeed here in terms of security, you know, the legal fabric of the state. You know, this is a large part. You know, the legal fabric, the members of the Conseil d'État, and that is more this that is to be compared than just courts, indeed. And then I mean, regarding your question on reform, the book is very quick on that in the end, but I mean, we're still a little bit raising the question of reform and on what ways are possible. So I mean, you know, one way would be the legal path would be to think about you know, a more open legal discussion within these courts, and that would go along the ways of legal dissent, for example, possibly legal opinions in dissenting legal opinions within the Constitutional Court, which would actually bring a different voice, in particular minority voices. That's what the lawyers would actually push. The political scientists would actually probably push more something which is more about legitimacy and representation within these courts, and in particular the role of the, you know, in the selection process, the role of the National Assembly, bringing, you know, minority, like in the German or Italian constitutional courts, where minority groups actually from the parliament bring or elect, you know, at a certain majority, but choose some judges of the court. So bringing a form of pluralism, and not just a relationship one-to-one between the Conseil d'État or the Conseil constitutionnel and the government, which is mostly the case for the Conseil constitutionnel, one has to say. And the last point of view would be not the political scientist, but the sociologist, and the sociologist would say, you know, these bodies should be more, this core should be more inclusive, more open, and in that sense, for example, the Conseil d'État should, you know, somehow be aggregated with lower rank administrative judges, which are far more diverse, are not only coming from the École nationale d'administration, Institut national du service public, so they're not coming from the top civil service track, but they're also just coming from law and just coming from
basic
law
law school.
just coming from law school, and actually develop, as I was saying, a form of attachment to public law, which is completely different. So you know, there's a variety of ways to think about change with you know, sort of social science forms of knowledge, I think.
Friends, this was a spirited debate. Merci Stéphanie Hennette-Vauchez. Merci Antoine Vauchez. Please join me. Let's give us a last round of applause.